My mother believed publicly disowning me in front of 200 guests on my 28th birthday would break me. She had the lawyers and a script ready. But she forgot that the microphone in her hand could also be used to pass sentence. I did not come here to plead guilty. I came to detonate a bomb set 20 years ago. Do you want to know what happens when the black sheep is actually the only wolf? My name is Sky Merriweather, and the invitation that brought me back to the lion's den was heavy enough to be a weapon. It was a thick, cream-colored square of cardstock with edges dipped in real gold, arriving by private courier at my small, rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn 3 days ago. The courier had looked at my peeling paint and my comfortable, lived-in porch with a sneer that belonged entirely to my mother, even though he was just a paid messenger. I had turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the embossed calligraphy under my thumb. It was an invitation to my 28th birthday party. The irony was not lost on me. My parents, Richard and Victoria Merriweather, the undisputed titans of Manhattan real estate, had not celebrated my birthday since I turned 18. That was the year I decided to study architecture at a state university instead of pursuing the business degree at Wharton they had paid for. That was the year I became, in their eyes, a bad investment for the last 3 years, since I officially declined a position at Merriweather Holdings to start my own freelance practice designing sustainable, low-income housing. The silence between us had been absolute. I was the architect who wanted to build homes. They were the tycoons who wanted to build empires. We spoke different languages, yet here I was. I stood before the imposing double doors of the Sterling Heights, a private club so exclusive that its existence was technically a rumor to anyone who did not have a 10-figure net worth. The building loomed over the Upper East Side, a fortress of limestone and arrogance. I smoothed down the front of my dress for the 10th time in 2 minutes. I had chosen a navy blue midi dress. It was elegant, made of good silk, but it was modest. It was something I had bought with my own money. Earnings from a renovation project in Queens. Against the backdrop of this place, however, I felt underdressed. I felt like a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. Why had I come? That was the question nagging at me. It was the rumors, the whispers in the industry tabloids that Richard Merriweather was failing, that his health was declining, that the Iron Man of New York real estate was finally rusting. A foolish, desperate part of me, the little girl who used to draw pictures of houses and wait by the door for her father to come home, hoped that this invitation was an olive branch. Maybe, just maybe, facing his own mortality had made him want to know his only daughter again. I pushed the doors open and walked inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was an overwhelming, cloying scent of white roses. My stomach turned. I hated white roses. They were cold, devoid of character, and they reminded me of funerals. My mother, Victoria, adored them. The grand ballroom was a sea of them. Massive arrangements stood on every table, hung from the ceiling, and lined the walls. It must have cost $50,000 just for the flora. It was a clear message this party might be for me, but it was styled by her. The air in the room was conditioned to a crisp, chilly temperature that made the skin on my bare arms prickle. But it wasn't just the temperature that felt cold. It was the atmosphere. I stepped further into the light of the crystal chandeliers, and my heart sank. This was not a birthday party. A birthday party has friends, laughter, perhaps a little bit of chaotic joy. This was a networking event. The room was packed with at least 200 people. And as I scanned the crowd, I realized I barely recognized a soul. There were men in Italian suits discussing mergers near the bar. There were women in haute couture dripping with diamonds, eyeing each other's jewelry with predatory assessments. I saw business partners my father had ruthlessly undercut in the past, now smiling and drinking his champagne. I saw journalists from major financial dailies hovering near the edges with their recorders tucked away. I was a stranger at my own celebration. Well, if it isn't the prodigal daughter, the voice was high, sweet, and laced with arsenic. I turned to see my cousin Eleanor approaching. Eleanor was 6 months older than me and had spent her entire life trying to be everything I wasn't. She was wearing a red sequined gown that screamed for attention, her blonde hair coiffed into a helmet of perfection. "Hello, Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple navy dress with a mixture of pity and glee. She took a sip of her champagne, leaving a smear of red lipstick on the rim. "We were taking bets on whether you would actually show up. Aunt Victoria said you wouldn't have the courage. I'm here to see my parents. Eleanor, not to play games." Eleanor stepped closer, invading my personal space. She smelled of expensive perfume and gin. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, you'll see them all right. You have no idea. Today is going to be memorable. Sky, you're going to be the absolute star of the show." She pulled back and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could ask her what she meant, she swirled away, disappearing into the throng of bodies. I needed a drink. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter's tray and tried to locate my parents. I spotted them near the center of the room, holding court. My father, Richard, looked frailer than I remembered. His suit hung a little looser on his frame, and there was a grayish cast to his skin, but his eyes were as sharp and hard as flint. He was laughing at something a heavy-set investor was saying, but the laugh sounded practiced. Beside him stood my mother, Victoria. She was a vision of ice queen perfection. She wore a silver gown that shimmered like mercury, and around her neck was the Merriweather Heritage pearl necklace, a piece of jewelry insured for more than most people earned in a lifetime. I started to make my way toward them, weaving through the tight knots of people. "Excuse me," I murmured. "Pardon me." When I was 10 feet away, my mother's eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, I expected a smile, a nod, a flicker of recognition. Instead, her gaze slid over me as if I were transparent, as if I were a smudge on a window pane. She turned her back to me, engaging a senator's wife in animated conversation. My father followed her lead, shifting his stance so that his shoulder blocked me out. I froze. The rejection was physical. It felt like a slap. They knew I was here. They had invited me, yet they wouldn't even acknowledge my presence. I retreated to the edge of the room, finding a spot near a marble pillar where I could observe without being seen. The hope I had carried in with me began to curdle into dread. Something was wrong. The energy in the room was too sharp, too expectant. People were glancing at me and then quickly looking away, whispering behind their hands. I felt like an exhibit in a zoo, or worse, a sacrifice waiting for the altar. I scanned the head table, the long dais set up on the stage where the family was supposed to sit. It was empty, except for one person. Sitting at the far end of the table was Arthur Blackwood. My blood ran cold. Mr. Blackwood had been the family's personal attorney for 40 years. He was a man who smiled only when he found a loophole in a contract. He was sitting alone, his untouched plate of food pushed to the side. In front of him, he had a thick, leather-bound folder. His hands were clasped on top of it, and he was staring straight ahead, not mingling, not drinking, not eating. Why was the family lawyer sitting at the head table of a birthday party with a stack of legal documents? I felt a sudden urge to run. My instincts, honed by years of navigating the emotional minefield of the Merriweather household, were screaming at me to leave. This wasn't a party. This was a trap. I looked around the opulent hall, and suddenly the walls felt like they were closing in. I was transported back to my childhood. The memories flooded in unbidden. I remembered the silence of the great hallway in our estate in the Hamptons. I remembered waiting for hours in the library for my parents to come home, only to be told by the nanny that they were too tired to say goodnight. I remembered the presents that were always expensive but never personal, the latest computer when I wanted an easel, the diamond earrings when I wanted a dog. I had grown up in a museum, not a home. I was a doll to be dressed up and shown off, a prop to complete the image of the perfect American family. When I stopped being a compliant doll, when I developed a voice and a spine, They didn't know what to do with me, so they put me in a box marked defective and stored me away. Now, they had dusted me off. But why Sky? I jumped. A waiter was standing there, offering to refill my water. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8 o'clock. The invitation said dinner would be served at 8. Suddenly, the music stopped. The ambient chatter in the room died down, rippling into silence as the guests turned toward the stage. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead flickered once, twice, and then went dark. The room was plunged into blackness. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Then, a single, blinding spotlight cut through the dark. It didn't land on the stage. It didn't land on the entrance. It landed on me. I blinked, blinded by the sudden intensity of the white light. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, for a heartbeat, a foolish, naive heartbeat. I thought, is this it? Is this the surprise I expected the strains of Happy Birthday to start playing? I expected a giant cake to be wheeled out, sparklers fizzing, my parents walking toward me with open arms, apologizing for the cold shoulder, explaining it was all part of the surprise. I forced a smile onto my face, ready to play the part of the surprised daughter. I waited for the cake, but there was no cake. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. No music played. No one sang. The spotlight pinned me against the pillar like an insect on a display board. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me in the darkness, but I could not see them. I was alone in the light, exposed, vulnerable, and terrifyingly confused. Then, I heard the click of a microphone turning on from the stage. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom, a harsh electronic pop that sounded like a gunshot. "Ladies and gentlemen," my mother's voice boomed from the darkness, devoid of any warmth, stripped of any maternal affection. "Please, take your seats." The illusion of perfection shattered. The game had begun. The spotlight did not waver. It held me in its white-hot grip, a specimen pinned to the velvet darkness of the ballroom. My eyes adjusted slowly, squinting past the glare to the stage where my mother stood. She was not smiling. The mask of the gracious hostess had vanished, replaced by the stony countenance of a judge delivering a verdict. The microphone in her hand was gripped so tightly that even from this distance, I could see her knuckles were white. "Thank you all for coming," Victoria Merriweather said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. It echoed off the high ceilings, filling every corner of the room. "I know many of you came here expecting a celebration. You came expecting toasts, cake, and the joyous commemoration of a daughter's 28th year." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost painful. "But we are not here to celebrate," she continued, her tone dropping an octave, becoming grave and somber. "We are here to cleanse." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. I heard the rustle of expensive fabric as people shifted in their seats. I stood frozen against the marble pillar, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Cleanse," the word hung in the air, heavy with threat. "For 28 years, my mother went on, pacing slowly across the stage, her silver gown catching the light like armor. "Richard and I have sacrificed everything for this family. We have built an empire from the ground up. We have weathered economic crashes, hostile takeovers, and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. We did it all for one reason: to leave a legacy, to ensure that the Merriweather name stood for integrity, strength, and honor." She stopped and pointed a manicured finger directly at me. The movement was so sudden, so accusatory, that I flinched physically. "But a legacy is only as strong as its weakest link," she declared. "And it breaks a mother's heart to admit that the rot is deep. It breaks my heart to stand before our closest friends and partners and admit that my own daughter, Sky Merriweather, has become a cancer to this family." The room erupted in gasps. I felt the blood drain from my face, my mouth opened to protest, to scream that she was lying. But no sound came out. The shock had paralyzed my vocal cords. "We tried," Victoria said, her voice trembling with a staged emotion that sounded terrifyingly real. God knows we tried. We gave her the best education. We gave her opportunities most people only dream of. And how did she repay us with betrayal? She looked out at the audience, her eyes wide and pleading for their sympathy. You see a quiet, modest girl standing there in a simple dress, but that is a costume. The reality is a life of debauchery that we have spent millions trying to cover up. Drug abuse, gambling debts, reckless behavior that has shamed us time and time again. That's a lie. I finally managed to choke out, but my voice was thin and weak, swallowed instantly by the cavernous room. No one heard me, or if they did, they didn't care. But we could have forgiven the personal failures, Victoria said, her voice hardening. We could have sent her to rehab again. We could have paid off the debts again. What we cannot forgive, what we will never forgive, is the treason against the company. She signaled to someone off stage. Skye didn't just leave the family business to find herself, as she claims. She was terminated. We found evidence, irrefutable evidence, that she was selling proprietary architectural designs and confidential bid information to our direct competitors. She has been leaking our secrets to fund her lifestyle. My knees buckled. I grabbed the pillar for support. Industrial espionage. It was an accusation that could end a career, that could send someone to prison. I had never taken a single paperclip from Merriweather Holdings. I lived in a walk-up apartment and shopped at thrift stores. The audacity of the lie was so immense it left me breathless. "Richard," my mother said, stepping back. "Please." My father stepped into the light. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, playing the role of the heartbroken patriarch to perfection. He took the microphone from her. He did not look at me. He looked at the floor, then at the audience, shaking his head slowly. "I loved her," he said, his voice raspy. "I loved her more than life itself. But love cannot blind us to reality. We offered her a path to redemption, a way to prove her loyalty and save the family from the financial ruin her leaks almost caused." I knew what he was talking about. The path to redemption was a marriage proposal from the son of the Sterling family, our biggest rival. It was a merger disguised as a wedding, a business transaction where I was the currency. I had refused. I had told them I would not be sold like cattle to cover their bad investments. "She refused," Richard said, his voice gaining strength. "She refused to do the one thing that could fix the damage she caused. She chose her own selfish pride over the survival of this family. She chose to let the ship sink rather than lift a finger to help bail it out." He looked up then, and for the first time, his eyes met mine. There was no love in them. There was only cold, hard calculation. "So, we have no choice," he announced, his voice booming. "We cannot let one person destroy what took 3 generations to build. We cannot harbor a traitor in our midst." He took a deep breath, standing tall, projecting his voice to the back of the room. "We are here to officially disown you." The words hit me like physical blows. "We are here to officially disown you." He had said it. He had said the words that severed the bond of blood and history. "From this moment forward," Richard declared, "Skye Merriweather is no longer a member of this family. She is cut off from our resources, our protection, and our name. And so you understand exactly who you are pitying." My mother's voice cut back in, sharp as a razor. "Let us show you the real Skye." The massive screen behind the stage, usually reserved for charity gala presentations, flickered to life. I watched in horror as a slideshow began. The first image was massive, 20 feet high. It showed me, or rather, a woman with my face stumbling out of a nightclub, a bottle of champagne in one hand, my dress torn, looking disheveled and intoxicated. The crowd murmured, "Disgusting," I heard a woman near me whisper. The next image showed me at a poker table in Las Vegas, surrounded by stacks of chips, laughing with a cigarette dangling from my lips. I had never smoked a cigarette in my life. I had never been to Las Vegas. "Photoshop," I whispered, my hands shaking uncontrollably. It's all Photoshop. But the images kept coming, faster and faster. Me on a yacht with questionable men. Me handing a folder marked confidential to a shadowy figure in a park. The editing was professional, flawless, to the untrained eye. To these people who were already primed to believe the worst, it was damning. I looked around the room, desperate for a friendly face. I saw the faces of people I had known since childhood. Mr. Henderson, my father's golf partner, looked at me with open contempt. Mrs. Vanderwall, who used to give me cookies when I was 6, turned her face away, shielding her eyes as if I were something obscene. I felt naked. I felt stripped of my dignity, my truth, my very identity. They were rewriting my history in real time, and I had no way to stop it. I was drowning in a sea of white roses and lies. Then, the movement caught my eye. Arthur Blackwood, the lawyer, rose from the head table. He did not look at the screen. He did not look at the crowd. He picked up the thick leather folder and walked down the stairs of the stage. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He walked with a singular purpose, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor. He walked straight toward me. The spotlight followed him, linking us together in a beam of light. He stopped 3 feet away from me. Up close, I could see the sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He looked nervous, which was out of character for the man who had drafted the contracts that gentrified half of Brooklyn. He opened the folder and produced a document. It was bound in blue paper. He placed it on a high cocktail table next to me and uncapped a heavy black fountain pen. "Sky," he said quietly. His voice low enough that the microphone didn't pick it up, but loud enough for the people circling us to hear. "This is a standard renunciation of inheritance and severance of ties agreement." He pushed the document toward me. "Your parents are generous people. Despite everything, they are willing to give you a one-time cash settlement of $50,000 to help you start your new life. But you must sign this now." I looked down at the paper. The legal jargon swam before my eyes, but the intent was clear. It was a complete and total waiver. By signing, I would agree that I had no claim to the Merriweather estate, no claim to future earnings, and most importantly, no claim to any trusts established in my name. "Sign it," someone in the crowd shouted. "Do the right thing for once," another voice yelled. It was a mob. My parents had weaponized the entire social register of New York City against me. They knew I was shy. They knew I hated confrontation. They were banking on the fact that I would crumble under the pressure, that I would sign anything just to make the spotlight go away, just to escape the burning gazes of 200 strangers. But why? Why this spectacle? If they just wanted to disown me, they could have done it quietly. They could have sent a letter. Why drag me here? Why stage this elaborate execution? My eyes locked onto the phrase, "any and all trusts." And then, it clicked. The realization hit me colder than the air conditioning. My grandfather, Old Man Merriweather, had died 10 years ago. He was a hard man, but he was fair, and he had hated my mother. He used to call her the shark in silk when he passed. The reading of the will had been a private affair, and I was told I had been left a small sum for college and nothing else. I had believed them, but if I had nothing, why did they need me to sign a waiver? You don't need a waiver for zero. You only need a waiver to relinquish something that exists. My parents weren't just disowning me. They were trying to legally pry me away from something that was already mine. They needed my signature because without it, they couldn't touch whatever my grandfather had left me. They had spent the last 10 years hiding it. And now, with the company failing and the debts mounting, they needed to access that capital. But they couldn't do it as long as I was the beneficiary. This wasn't a birthday party. It wasn't even a family dispute. It was a heist. I looked up from the paper. I looked at Blackwood, who was refusing to meet my eyes. I looked past him to the stage, where my parents stood hand in hand, posing as the tragic victims of a wayward child. They looked triumphant. They thought they had won. They thought the fear and the shame would break me. They thought I was the scared little girl who used to hide in the library. I felt the trembling in my hands stop. the nausea that had been roiling in my stomach settled into a cold, hard knot of anger. It was a clarity unlike anything I had ever felt before. The spotlight was no longer an interrogation lamp. It was a stage light, and if they wanted a show, I would give them one. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't reach for the check. I looked at the crowd, seeing them for what they were, sheep following the loudest voice. Then I looked at the stage. My mother was holding the microphone loosely now, confident that the script was ending. She was wrong. The script was just beginning. I took a step forward. Ignoring the pen Blackwood was thrusting toward me. I walked past him. I walked past the jeering faces of my cousin Eleanor and her friends. I walked straight toward the stage. "She's going to beg," I heard a man whisper. "Watch. She's going to get on her knees." I climbed the stairs to the stage. My heels clicked rhythmically, a metronome counting down to the explosion. My parents watched me come, a flicker of uncertainty crossing my father's face. He hadn't expected me to approach. He had expected me to run or to sign. I stopped in front of them. Up close, I could see the heavy makeup filling the cracks in my mother's face. I could see the fear behind my father's eyes. I didn't say a word to them. Not yet. I reached out and, with a firm, steady hand, I took the microphone from my mother's grip. She was so surprised she let it go without a fight. I turned to face the room. The blinding light washed over me. But this time, I didn't blink. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone. I was Sky Merriweather, and I was about to burn this whole house down. The silence that followed Mr. Blackwood's demand was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the collective judgment of 200 of New York's elite. I stood there, the document hovering before me like a death warrant for my identity. And for a fleeting moment, the urge to simply dissolve was overwhelming. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole, dragging me down into the dark earth where the blinding white spotlight could not reach me. I looked around the room, my eyes frantically searching for a lifeline. Surely, amidst these people who had eaten at our table, who had vacationed on our yachts, who had called me sweetheart and darling since I was in pigtails, there was one person who would stand up, one person who would say this was cruel, one person who would say this was wrong. My gaze landed on Julian Sterling. He was standing near the champagne tower, leaning casually against a pillar clad in velvet. Julian was the man my parents had tried to force me to marry. He was the perfect match, the son of their greatest rival, the key to the merger that would have saved Merriweather Holdings. I had rejected him not just because I didn't love him, but because he was a vapid, cruel man who treated women like accessories to match his Italian sports cars. Julian was not looking at me with pity. He was looking at me with a smirk that curled the corner of his mouth like a hook. He raised his crystal flute in a mock toast, his eyes dancing with malicious amusement. In that smirk, I saw the truth of this entire social circle. They did not care about truth. They did not care about justice. They were sharks, and they had smelled blood in the water. My blood, to them. This wasn't a tragedy. It was entertainment. It was better than the opera, better than the theater. It was the live destruction of a human being. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was completely, utterly alone. But in that abyss of isolation, a voice echoed from the past. It was gravelly, smelling of old tobacco and leather, in business and in war. Sky. The first one to lose their temper is the one who loses the game. Grandfather. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, inhaling sharply. I could almost feel his heavy hand on my shoulder. He had been a ruthless man. Yes, but he had possessed a code. He despised theatrics. He despised emotional outbursts. Emotion is a fog. He used to tell me while teaching me to play chess in his study. It blinds you to the board. Clear the fog. Sky, look at the pieces, not the ones they want you to see, but the ones they are hiding in their palms. I opened my eyes. I took a deep breath. Pushing down the rising bile in my throat, I forced myself to stop looking at the faces of the crowd. They were irrelevant. They were just the audience. I needed to look at the players. I looked at the stage. I looked at my mother. Victoria Merriweather was standing perfectly still. her chin raised in that regal pose she had perfected for magazine covers. She looked invincible, but then I looked closer. I looked with the eyes of an architect, trained to spot the hairline fractures in a foundation before the building collapses. Her hand, the hand holding the microphone, was trembling. It was a minute vibration, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The diamonds on her wrist were shivering in the light. Why was she shaking? She had won. She had humiliated me. She had the crowd on her side. She had the lawyer. She held all the cards. A woman in her position, executing a flawlessly planned coup, should have been steady as a rock. Unless she wasn't winning. Unless she was terrified. Fear, that was the tremor. My mother was afraid. But afraid of what, me the daughter she had just painted as a drug-addled failure, no. You do not fear the bug you are about to crush. You fear the trap you are about to step into. My gaze snapped back to the document Arthur Blackwood was holding out to me. The renunciation of inheritance. Look at the pieces. Grandfather's voice whispered. I leaned in slightly, ignoring the pen. I focused on the text. It was upside down from my perspective, but I had spent years reading blueprints from every angle. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of legal text. It was standard boilerplate language about severing ties, waiving rights to the estate, accepting the $50,000 payout, but then, nestled in the middle of paragraph 4, section B, I saw it. It was a single sentence, written in a slightly smaller font, buried between two massive clauses about non-disclosure agreements, hereby irrevocably transfers, assigns, and delivers any and all voting rights, dividends, and beneficial interests in the Merryweather. 1998, irrevocable trust to the grantors. The Merryweather, 1998, irrevocable trust. My heart skipped a beat, then restarted with a slow, heavy thud. The year 1998. I was barely a toddler then. My parents hadn't set up a trust for me in 1998. In 1998, my father was nearly bankrupt from a failed casino venture in Atlantic City. He didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, let alone assets to put into a trust. But grandfather did. 1998 was the year grandfather sold his shipping logistics company for $300 million. The fog in my mind vanished instantly. The tears that had been threatening to spill over evaporated, dried up by the sudden, searing heat of comprehension. This wasn't about my lifestyle. This wasn't about the fake photos. This wasn't about me refusing to marry Julian Sterling. This wasn't even about them hating me. It was so much simpler, and so much viler than that. It was a robbery. They didn't want me out of the family because I was an embarrassment. They needed me out of the legal picture because I was the obstacle. Grandfather must have left something to me, something significant, something tied to that trust, and the only way they could get their hands on it to cover their debts, to save their crumbling empire, to keep buying white roses and pearl necklaces, was if I voluntarily signed it away. They were using shame as a weapon to commit fraud. I looked at the paper again. That piece of paper wasn't a punishment. It was a confession. It was proof that I possessed something they desperately needed. The pain that had been crushing my chest a moment ago dissipated. It was replaced by a sensation I had never felt toward my parents before. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was disgust. Pure, icy disgust. I looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time in years. I saw the desperate lines around my father's eyes. I saw the panic hidden behind my mother's makeup. They weren't titans. They were scavengers. They were picking the bones of their own daughter to feed their greed. And what did I owe them? I thought about the last 10 years. I thought about the nights I spent waiting tables to pay for my textbooks because my father claimed the company was illiquid that semester. I thought about the first apartment I rented, a studio in Queens with no heat, while they renovated the guest house in the Hamptons for $3 million. I thought of every birthday forgotten, every achievement ignored, every time I had called home just to hear a voice and was sent to voicemail. I had built my life from scratch. I had built my career with my own hands, my own mind, my own sweat. I didn't owe them my loyalty. I didn't owe them my signature. and I certainly didn't owe them my inheritance. Crash. The sound of shattering glass sliced through the tension like a knife. A waiter, perhaps unnerved by the heavy silence or the intensity of the scene, had dropped a tray of champagne flutes near the edge of the dance floor. The sharp, violent noise made half the room jump. For me, it was a starting gun. The sound woke up something primal in my brain. It was the sound of reality breaking through the theater. It broke the hypnotic spell of the victimhood they had cast over me. I wasn't the victim here. I was the target. And targets can shoot back. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at my father, Richard Merriweather, the man who was supposedly casting me out. I locked my eyes onto his. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see that the crying, broken girl he expected was gone. He held my gaze for less than a second before he flinched. He looked away, pretending to adjust his cufflinks, pretending to cough. He couldn't look at me. He was a coward. That realization was the final fuel I needed. His cowardice was the spark that lit the fuse of my courage. If he was afraid to look me in the eye while he was destroying my life, then he was weak. And if he was weak, he could be beaten. I looked at Blackwood. The lawyer was still holding the pen out, but his arm was starting to sag. He looked uncomfortable. He sensed the shift too. He knew that the moment for a quick, shame-induced capitulation had passed. "Sky," he hissed, a note of urgency entering his voice. "Sign the paper. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I didn't answer him. I reached up and touched the collar of my navy blue dress. I smoothed the fabric down over my hips. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back until I stood at my full height. I lifted my chin. I was done hiding. I was done apologizing for existing. I took a step, not backward, toward the exit, not forward, toward the pen. I stepped toward the stairs. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. They had expected me to run out crying. They had expected me to sign the paper and vanish. They did not expect me to walk toward the executioners. "What is she doing?" I heard Eleanor whisper loudly. "She's going to beg," someone else said. "It's pathetic. Let them think that. Let them think I was coming to plead for mercy. Let them think I was coming to grovel for a place back at the table. Their arrogance was my camouflage." I walked past Blackwood without even glancing at him. I left him standing there with his pen and his fraudulent contract, looking like a fool. I approached the stairs to the stage. They were carpeted in red velvet. Every step I took felt heavy, grounded, deliberate. My heels sank into the plush fabric. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. The silence in the room changed frequency. It went from the silence of judgment to the silence of suspense. Why wasn't security stopping me? I knew why. Because to the guards, to the guests, to my parents, I was still the daughter. I was the defeated, humiliated child coming to her mother. It didn't look like a threat. It looked like a surrender. They were so wrong. I reached the top of the stairs. I was on the stage now. The lights were blindingly bright here, hot on my skin. I could smell the expensive cologne my father wore, mixed with the metallic tang of fear that seemed to radiate from them. My mother watched me approach. Her eyes widened slightly. She clutched the microphone to her chest, as if it were a shield. She didn't know what to do. The script didn't cover this. The script said, I stayed on the floor. I stopped 2 feet away from her. I was close enough to see the spiderweb of veins in her eyes. I was close enough to see the pulse jumping in her throat. She opened her mouth, perhaps to tell me to get off the stage, perhaps to mock me one last time, but I didn't give her the chance. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my hand to strike her, though God knows the impulse was there. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile, a smile that said, I know. And then, I reached out. The distance between my mother and me was less than 2 feet, but it felt like the gap between 2 different realities. In her reality, she was the queen, and I was the usurper who had climbed onto her throne to beg for mercy. In my reality, I was the executioner, and she had unknowingly placed her head on the block. Victoria Merriweather saw my hand coming. but her reflexes were dulled by arrogance. She tried to pull the microphone back, clutching it to her chest like a desperate singer protecting her final note. But I was younger, faster, and fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage. My fingers closed around the black metal handle. Her grip was tight, but mine was iron. I didn't ask for it. I didn't tug gently. I ripped it from her hand with a violent, decisive jerk. The motion was so sudden that her fingernails scraped against the mesh, creating a sound like tearing silk, but that was nothing compared to what happened next. As the microphone swung through the air, passing directly in front of the stage monitors, it let out a piercing, high-pitched screech of feedback. Scrick! The sound was agonizing. It was a sonic weapon that sliced through the ballroom, shattering the heavy silence. 200 people instinctively covered their ears, wincing in unison. Glasses rattled on the tables. The feedback loop cut off as quickly as it had started, leaving behind a ringing silence that was even more profound than before. I stood center stage, the microphone now firmly in my hand. My mother stood empty-handed, her arms still raised in a phantom defensive posture. Looking at her empty palms in disbelief, she looked small, without the amplification of her voice, without the prop of her authority. She was just a terrified woman in a shiny dress. I brought the microphone to my lips. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But my hands were steady. I looked out at the sea of faces, the bankers, the real estate moguls, the gossip columnists, the social climbers. They were all staring at me, mouths slightly agape, waiting for the meltdown. They were waiting for the tears, the incoherence, the plea. I gave them a smile instead. It wasn't a nice smile. It wasn't the polite, practiced smile of a debutante. It was a baring of teeth. It was radiant, terrifying, and completely unhinged from the script they had written for me. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad," I said. My voice boomed through the speakers, crystal clear, startlingly calm. It didn't waver. It didn't crack. It possessed a resonance that commanded the room, a timbre of authority that I didn't know I possessed until that very moment. Thank you for this surprise party. Truly, I have to say, of all the birthdays I have spent alone, this one is certainly the most memorable. I paused, letting the irony soak into the carpet. I saw confusion ripple through the front row. They didn't know how to react to sarcasm. They were programmed for drama, not satire. Here it is, I continued, pacing slowly to the edge of the stage, looming over the guests like a preacher at a revival. You have all heard the verdict. I am to be disowned, cast out, erased from the Merriweather tapestry like a stain, and you have heard the reasons why: the drugs, the gambling, the betrayal, the leaks. I nodded slowly, acting as if I were considering the charges. Then, I stopped pacing. I locked eyes with the CEO of First National Bank, who was sitting at table 3. "It is a compelling story," I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "It has everything a good scandal needs: tragedy, vice, a fallen angel. But there is just one small problem with it." I straightened up, my voice snapping back like a whip. "It is all a lie designed to cover up a felony." The gasp that went through the room was not the polite intake of breath from before. This was a visceral, guttural sound of shock. "I didn't leave this family because I wanted to party," I declared, my voice rising, filling every corner of the Sterling Heights ballroom. "I didn't refuse to work for Merriweather Holdings because I was lazy. I left because I possessed something my parents lost 20 years ago: a conscience." I turned back to my parents. My mother had taken a step back, clutching my father's arm. My father, Richard, was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. His face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Tell them, Dad," I challenged him, pointing the microphone at him like a weapon. "Tell them why I really refused to come back to the company 3 years ago. Tell them what you asked me to do." He didn't speak. He couldn't speak. He was paralyzed by the sudden shift in power dynamics. "He won't tell you," I said to the crowd, turning my back on him. So I will. I am not being disowned because I am a liability. I am being disowned because I refuse to be an accomplice. I took a deep breath, preparing to drop the first bomb. The Merryweather Empire is not an empire, I said, enunciating every syllable. It is a house of cards. It is a shell game. And to be more specific, it is a Ponzi scheme. The words hung in the air for a second. Radioactive. Then, the room exploded. What? Someone shouted. That's absurd, another voice cried. Is this a joke? Chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted. Agitated, I saw the investors looking at each other, their eyes wide with sudden panic. The word Ponzi is the one word that strikes true fear into the hearts of the wealthy. You can accuse them of adultery, of cruelty, even of murder, and they might shrug. But accuse them of losing money, that is the ultimate sin. You heard me, I said, cutting through the noise. New investors are paying off the old investors. The returns you have been seeing on your quarterly statements, they don't exist. They are numbers typed into a spreadsheet by my mother at 3 a.m. because they fired the accounting firm that asked too many questions. Shut up. The roar came from behind me. It was primal, animalistic. I turned just in time to see my father, Richard Merryweather, lunging at me. The facade of the frail, sickly old man had vanished. In his panic, adrenaline had flooded his system, giving him the strength of a desperate man. He was coming for the microphone. He was coming to silence me. Physically, violently. The crowd screamed. A few men stood up, but no one moved to intervene. They were too captivated by the spectacle. My father was fast, but I was ready. I didn't run. I stepped back, calmly, creating just enough distance so that his outstretched hand clawed at empty air. He stumbled, off balance, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "Don't you dare touch me!" I yelled, my voice amplified to a deafening volume. "Don't you take one more step. Richard, unless you want every single person in this room to know exactly what happened with the West Coast project." The effect was instantaneous. My father froze. It was as if I had shot him. He stopped mid-stride, his foot hovering an inch off the floor before he brought it down. Heavily, unsteadily, the color drained from his face so completely that he looked like a corpse standing upright. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His hands, which had been reaching for my throat a second ago, dropped uselessly to his sides. The West Coast project. It was the magic word. It was the skeleton in the closet that was so large it cracked the doorframe. The room fell silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It was the silence of predators scenting a kill. The investors, the sharks in suits, leaned forward. They knew the West Coast project. It was the flagship development that was supposed to triple the company's value next year. It was the project they had all poured millions into, and my father's reaction just told them everything they needed to know. "That's right," I said, lowering the microphone slightly, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "He knows what I'm talking about, and judging by the look on his face, I think some of you are starting to guess too." I walked around my father, circling him like a wolf. He didn't turn to face me. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes unfocused, seeing his life disintegrate. "You all think I was the one who leaked secrets?" I asked, addressing the crowd again. "You think I was the one selling designs? The only thing I leaked was the truth, and I only did it to myself, when I walked away." I stopped in front of the table where the representative from the Sterling family sat Julian's father. 3 years ago, I said, speaking directly to him, my father asked me to sign off on the structural integrity reports for the West Coast foundations. I was the architect of record. He needed my stamp. He needed my name. I paused. I went to the site. I inspected the concrete. I checked the rebar, and I found that they were using materials that were 40% cheaper than what was billed. 40% cheaper, and 60% weaker. If I had signed those papers, that building would have collapsed within 5 years. Thousands of people would have died. Mr. Sterling's face went gray. He had a glass of scotch halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, his hand shaking. "I refuse to sign," I said, turning back to the room. "I refuse to be a murderer for profit. And that is when I became the enemy. That is when I became the drug addict. That is when I became the disappointment." I walked back to center stage. I felt a surge of power coursing through my veins that was intoxicating. For years, I had let them define me. I had let them tell the world who I was. I had let them paint me as the villain. But tonight, I held the brush. "You look at me and you see a defendant," I said, my voice ringing with steel. "You see a daughter on trial, but you are looking at the wrong person." I pointed a finger at my mother, who was now weeping silently. Not fake tears this time, but real tears of terror. I pointed at my father, who was leaning against the podium, gasping for breath. "I am not the defendant here," I announced. "I am the prosecutor, and the people standing behind me. They are not victims. They are frauds." I looked at Arthur Blackwood, the lawyer. He was frantically trying to stuff papers back into his briefcase, looking for an exit. "And you, Mr. Blackwood," I said, calling him out by name. "Don't think you are going anywhere, because if there is a Ponzi scheme, there is always a lawyer who drafted the paperwork, and I think the Bar Association will be very interested to hear about your role in the creation of the shell companies in the Caymans." Blackwood froze. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in the eyes of the man who scared everyone else. I had flipped the board. The game had changed completely. I wasn't just defending my reputation anymore. I was dismantling their entire existence, brick by brick, lie by lie. "You wanted to disown me," I asked, turning back to my father. "You wanted to cut me off. You wanted to publicly shame me so I would sign away my rights." I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. "You don't have to disown me, Dad, because I disowned you the day you asked me to kill people for money. The only difference is, I didn't need a party to do it. I just needed a spine." The room was in chaos now. People were shouting questions. Investors were pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their brokers, trying to pull their money out before the news broke. The illusion of the perfect Merriweather family had been nuked, but I wasn't done, not even close. I looked at the big screen behind me, where the photoshopped image of me at the poker table was still frozen. "And just so we are clear on the details," I said, "since you like pictures so much." I reached into the small clutch bag I had brought with me. I pulled out my phone. "I think it is time we updated the slideshow." I held my phone up, not like a weapon, but like a remote control, which, in a very literal sense, it was 3 years ago, before I was cast out, before I was the black sheep. I was the architect who oversaw the renovation of the Sterling Heights. I knew every inch of this building. I knew the load-bearing walls, the ventilation shafts, and I certainly knew the audio-visual system. I had personally coded the override protocols for the main ballroom displays to ensure that in the event of a fire, the emergency evacuation routes would project onto every screen in the building, overriding any other input. It was a safety feature. Tonight, I was using it to burn the house down. I tapped the screen 3 times. Access code, override command, mirror device. The connection was instantaneous. On the massive 20-foot screen behind me, the humiliating, photoshopped image of me smoking at a poker table flickered and vanished. The room blinked as the bright, garish colors were replaced by the stark, blinding white of a PDF document. The silence in the room shifted from confused to clinical. "You like stories," I said, my voice cutting through the air. "So let us read a story written in numbers, because unlike my mother, numbers do not know how to lie." I swiped on my phone, and the document on the big screen scrolled down. It was a bank statement, but not just any statement. It was the internal ledger for the Merriweather Family Charity Foundation, a nonprofit organization that my parents used to host galas for. Weeping on stage about underprivileged children while collecting checks from everyone in this room. "This is the transaction history for the foundation from last month," I explained, acting as a tour guide through their corruption. I pointed to a highlighted line item. You will see a withdrawal of $250,000 on the 14th. I paused, letting the figure sink in. $250,000. The memo says, Emergency Relief Logistics. Sounds noble. Does it not? But if you look at the routing number in the next column, I swiped again, bringing up a second document, a cross-referenced wire transfer receipt. You will see that the money did not go to a disaster zone. It went to a private account held by Van Cleef and Arpels. I lowered the phone slowly and pointed a finger directly at my mother's throat. That necklace, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. The Merriweather Heritage Pearls. You told everyone it was a family heirloom passed down from great-grandmother, but we both know great-grandmother's jewelry was sold 5 years ago to pay off the interest on the chaotic loans you took out to hide the losses in the European market. Victoria's hand flew to her neck, clutching the pearls as if they burned her skin. Her face was a mask of sheer horror. That necklace is not an heirloom. Mother, I continued, speaking to her but addressing the room. It is brand new, and it was paid for with the money these people donated to feed orphans in the Bronx. You are wearing $250,000 of stolen charity money. Lies, Victoria shrieked. It was a sound that tore her throat, desperate and shrill. Security, get her off the stage. Cut the feed. Kill the power. She looked frantically toward the wings where the head of security was standing. He was a large man named Miller, someone who had worked for our family for a decade. Miller took a step forward, his hand moving to his radio, but before he could give the order, a hand shot up from the front row. It was Mr. Sterling, Julian's father, the billionaire industrialist, whose net worth dwarfed even what my parents pretended to have. He did not shout. He simply raised a hand, palm out, in a gesture of absolute command. He looked at Miller, then looked at the screen, and then looked back at Miller. He shook his head once. Miller froze. He looked at my screaming mother, then at the silent, furious billionaire. He took his hand off the radio and stepped back into the shadows. The message was clear. The room wanted to see the rest of the show. The investors were no longer guests. They were creditors, and they were watching their assets evaporate in real time. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, I said, acknowledging him with a nod. You will want to see this next part. I swiped the screen again. A new document appeared. This one was an email chain. The subject line read, Urgent Pre-Audit Collateral Acquisition Strategy. My parents told you I was disowned because I refused to marry Julian Sterling, I said, turning to look at Julian, who was standing frozen near the bar, his smirk long gone. They called it refusing a family obligation. They made it sound like a romantic alliance between two great houses, a fairy tale. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. But it was not a marriage proposal. Julian, it was a sale. I zoomed in on the email text on the screen. It was an email from my father to his accountant, dated 3 months ago. I read the text aloud, my voice echoing off the walls. We need the Sterling merger finalized by the 1st of the month. If we do not get access to their liquidity, the auditors will find the $50 million hole in the construction budget. We need to leverage Sky, get Julian on board. If we marry them, the Sterlings won't look too closely at the books until it is too late. I let the words hang there. $50 million. $50 million, I repeated, letting the number roll off my tongue like a curse. That is the deficit my father is trying to hide. That is the cost of the cheap materials, the bribes to inspectors, and the bad investments. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking directly at Julian. The arrogant boy who had laughed at me 5 minutes ago now looked sick. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open. Did you hear that? Julian, I asked softly. You thought you were getting a trophy wife. You thought you were winning a prize, but you were just a plug for a $50 million drain. My parents were selling me to you to buy your father's silence. They were counting on the fact that once our families were legally bound, Your father would not prosecute them for fraud when the West Coast building inevitably started to crack. I turned my gaze to Mr. Sterling. The man was shaking. He was looking at my father with an expression that promised violence. He realized now that he hadn't just almost married his son into a prestigious family. He had almost merged his life's work with a sinking ship. He had almost let a parasite attach itself to his empire. They played you, I told him. They played all of you. I swiped to the final slide. It was a spreadsheet summarizing the total debt versus total assets of Merriweather Holdings. The numbers were bathed in red ink. Look at the bottom line, I commanded. Negative $120 million. The company is insolvent. The lifestyle you see, the parties, the jets, the villas, it is all being paid for on credit that is secured by assets that do not exist. I gestured to the room, to the flowers, to the champagne. This party, it is not paid for. The check to the catering company is going to bounce on Monday morning. I know this because I saw the overdraft alert on the company server before I came out here. I turned back to my parents. My father was leaning heavily against the podium. Clutching his chest, he looked small. He looked defeated. But I felt no pity. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. You called me a traitor, I said to him. You called me a failure. But I am the only person who tried to stop you. I am the only one who said no. The room was no longer silent. The shock had broken, replaced by a rising tide of fury. It started as a low rumble, like thunder approaching from a distance. Is this true? A woman shouted from the back. Richard, tell me this isn't true. I have my pension fund with you. You stole from the charity, another man yelled, his voice cracking with rage. You stole from children. Answer her. The shouts came faster, overlapping, angry. The veneer of civility had completely dissolved. These were not polite society people anymore. They were people who realized they had been robbed. They were people who realized they had been dining with thieves. My mother tried to speak, but her voice was drowned out by the booing. It started with one person, then 5, then the whole room. It was a wall of sound, a physical wave of rejection crashing onto the stage. They weren't looking at me with contempt anymore. They were looking at my parents, and the look in their eyes was dangerous. I stood in the center of the storm, the eye of the hurricane. I lowered the microphone slightly. I didn't need it anymore. The truth was out. The bomb had detonated, and the shockwave was leveling everything in sight. I looked at Arthur Blackwood. The lawyer had stopped trying to pack his briefcase. He was staring at the floor, defeated. He knew it was over. The paper trail was on the screen, 20 feet high, for the world to see. There was no loophole for this. There was no settlement that could fix this. I disconnected my phone. The screen went black, plunging the room back into the dim ambient light. But the damage was done. The images were burned into their retinas. The numbers were etched into their minds. My parents stood alone on one side of the stage, isolated by their crimes. I stood on the other, isolated by my truth. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was afraid. The anger in the room was a physical force, a gale blowing against the stage where my parents stood, shivering and exposed. But I did not let the chaos consume me. I needed the room to be quiet for what came next. I needed them to hear the final turn of the screw. I raised the microphone again. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The authority I had claimed over the last 10 minutes had given me the power to command silence with a simple clearing of my throat. But the money is not the only secret in this room, I said. My voice was softer now, dropping the sharp edge of the prosecutor and adopting a tone that was almost wistful. There is one more ghost we need to summon. The man who built this empire. The man whose name you have all been trading on for decades. The mention of the founder caused the murmuring to die down. Even my father, who looked like he was on the verge of a stroke, looked up. Grandfather, I said, letting the word hang in the air. Silas Merriweather, to the world, he was a tycoon of steel and concrete. To my parents, he was a bank vault they were waiting to crack open. But to me, To me, he was the smell of old tobacco and peppermint. He was the scratch of a fountain pen on paper. He was the only person in that cold, echoing mansion who had ever looked at me and seen a human being, not an accessory. 10 years ago, I continued, on my 18th birthday, my parents threw a party very much like this one. It was loud, it was expensive, and just like tonight, it was not for me, it was for them. I walked slowly across the stage, my heels making no sound on the carpet now. I was lost in the memory, pulling the audience in with me. I hid in the library that night. I was crying because my mother had criticized my dress in front of the senator from New York, and that was where Grandfather found me. I looked at Arthur Blackwood. The lawyer was still freezing, clutching his briefcase, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "Mr. Blackwood, you were there that night. Were you not? You were standing outside the door." Blackwood nodded stiffly. He remembered. "Grandfather was sick then," I told the crowd. "He knew he was dying. He sat me down in his leather chair, the one you sold last year. Mother, to pay for your trip to Milan, and he handed me a letter, a thick, heavy envelope sealed with red wax." I closed my eyes for a second, seeing the trembling hand of the old man, feeling the weight of the paper. He told me, "Sky, you are the only one in this family with a spine. Your father is weak, your mother is hungry. They will eat everything I built until there is nothing left but bones, and eventually, when there is nothing left to eat, they will try to eat you." My mother let out a gasp. "He never said that he loved us." I opened my eyes and looked at her with pity. "He knew you, Mother, better than you know yourself. He made me promise not to open that envelope until a specific condition was met. He said, 'Keep this sealed until the day the family turns their back on you. Keep it until they try to cut you out completely, because that is the day you will need a shield.'" I turned to the audience. "I opened that letter 3 years ago, the day I left, and inside, I found a copy of the original trust agreement, the Merriweather 1998 Irrevocable Trust." I looked back at Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, you have the file in front of you. Open it." The lawyer hesitated. "Open it," I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. Blackwood fumbled with the leather strap of his folio. His fingers were shaking so badly he dropped a few papers on the floor. He scrambled to pick them up. Finally locating the thick, yellow document I was referring to, "Turn to page 42, I instructed. "Paragraph 7, subsection C, read it, to yourself." Blackwood flipped the pages. The sound of crisp paper was the only noise in the cavernous room. He found the page. He adjusted his glasses. He began to read. I watched the color drain from his face. It didn't just fade. It vanished, leaving him looking like a wax figure. His mouth fell open. He looked up at me, then at my parents, then back at the document with horror. "You see it now, don't you?" I asked. "This cannot be right," Blackwood stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I drafted the amendment in 2015. You drafted an amendment based on the copy my father gave you," I cut in. "But Grandfather filed the original with the state probate court 3 days before he died, and the original has a bad actor clause, a poison pill." I turned to the confused crowd to explain. "My parents have been telling you that they are disowning me to protect the family assets. They brought me here, in front of 200 witnesses, to force me to sign a waiver. They thought that if they publicly humiliated me, if they legally severed our ties, they could bypass the trust's age restriction and access the capital immediately." I smiled. It was the smile of the wolf my grandfather had warned them about. But Grandfather was a chess player. He knew that Richard and Victoria would eventually try to get rid of me to steal my share, so he wrote a clause into the very DNA of the trust. I recited the words from memory. I had memorized them every night for 3 years. "In the event that the trustees, that is you, Richard and Victoria, act with malice to alienate, disown, or publicly defame the primary beneficiary, that is me, or attempt to coerce said beneficiary into relinquishing their rights. I paused for effect. Then the trustees shall be immediately and irrevocably removed for cause, and upon their removal, the trust shall not dissolve. Instead, full control, legal title, and sole directorship of the Merriweather Foundation and all its assets shall transfer immediately and 100% to the beneficiary, regardless of age. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hovering at the top of its arc. "Do you understand what you just did?" I asked my father, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. "Grandfather set a trap, and the trigger for that trap was you disowning me." I swept my arm across the room. If you had done this quietly, in a lawyer's office, maybe you could have fought it. Maybe you could have argued it was a mutual separation. But you didn't. You were so arrogant, so desperate to destroy me, that you did it here. I pointed to the camera crews at the back of the room. You filmed it. You recorded it. You stood on this stage 10 minutes ago, and you shouted into a microphone, "We are here to officially disown you." You gave the exact legal declaration required to activate paragraph 7. I took a step closer to them. You didn't just kick me out of the family, Dad. You just fired yourself. My father looked like he had been hit by a truck. He grabbed the edge of the podium, his knuckles white. He looked at Blackwood, desperate for a lifeline. "Arthur, tell her she's wrong. Tell her it's not legal." Blackwood looked up, sweat streaming down his face. He shook his head slowly. "It is a self-executing clause. Richard, the moment you made the public declaration, the transfer was automatic. It is ironclad. Silas wrote it himself." "No," my mother whispered. "No, no, no." "Yes," I said. "By trying to take the little bit I had left, you just handed me everything." I gestured to the ballroom, to the hotel, to the city beyond. "The building we are standing in, it is owned by the trust. The house in the Hamptons owned by the trust. The majority shares in Merriweather Holdings owned by the trust." I looked my mother dead in the eye. "Even the pearls around your neck. Mother, they are listed as trust assets, which means you are currently wearing my property." My mother let out a strangled cry. She clawed at the necklace, trying to undo the clasp, but her fingers were shaking too hard. The string broke. Pop, pop, pop. Pearls worth $250,000 cascaded down her silver dress, bouncing onto the stage floor, rolling away in every direction like marbles. She fell to her knees, scrambling to catch them, looking pathetic and small. My father collapsed into the chair behind him. He didn't move. He just stared at the wall, his mouth hanging open, his empire turning to ash in his mouth. "You wanted a verdict," I said, looking down at them. "You wanted a judgment. Well, here it is. You are not the victims of a rebellious daughter. You are the victims of your own greed." I turned back to the audience. The shock on their faces had turned to awe. They had watched a crucifixion turn into a coronation in the span of 20 minutes. "Mr. Blackwood?" I said. The lawyer jumped. "Yes, Ms. Merriweather." "Ms. Merriweather," I repeated, tasting the name. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a weapon. "I assume you have the transfer protocols in that file as well." Yes, I do." "Good. Initiate them. Now, freeze all accounts associated with Richard and Victoria Merriweather. Suspend their corporate credit cards, and alert security that any attempt by them to remove assets from the premises is to be treated as theft." "Sky, please," my mother wailed from the floor, clutching a handful of pearls. "We are your parents. You can't do this. We will be destitute." I looked down at her. I remembered the 10-year-old girl with the high fever, begging her mother not to go on vacation. I remembered the 18-year-old girl crying in the library. I remembered the 28-year-old woman standing in the spotlight, waiting for a cake that never came. "You should have thought of that," I said, my voice cold as the grave. "Before you invited 200 people to watch you execute me." I looked at the crowd. "The party is over for them," I announced. But for the rest of you, the real Merriweather family is just getting started. The transition was complete. The air in the room had changed. The investors, the sharks, they smelled the blood, but they also smelled the power. And power is the only currency that matters in this world. They weren't looking at my father anymore. They were looking at me. And I stood there, amidst the scattered pearls and the shattered egos. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like my grandfather's granddaughter. But the night wasn't finished. There was still the matter of the friends who had laughed. There was still the matter of the aunt who had mocked me. And there was one final secret, one last twist of the knife that even I didn't see coming until the very end. But for now, the gavel had banged. The ownership had changed hands. And the silence in the room was the sound of a new reign beginning. The sound of the pearls hitting the stage floor was the signal. In the wild, when a dominant predator falls, there is a moment of hesitation. The scavengers watch, waiting to see if the lion will get back up. But once they realize the wound is fatal, the hesitation vanishes. They do not mourn, they feast. My parents were on the floor, my mother on her knees, amidst the scattered beads of her stolen necklace. My father collapsed in his chair. A broken king in a crumbling castle, and the room, filled with people who had eaten their food, drunk their wine, and laughed at their jokes for 30 years, smelled the blood in the water. The transformation was instantaneous and grotesque. The mask of high society slipped off, revealing the raw, ugly opportunism underneath. The first rat to jump ship was my cousin Eleanor. 5 minutes ago, Eleanor had been standing with her friends, sipping champagne and waiting for my humiliation to be complete so she could gloat. She had whispered that I would be the star of the show. Now, seeing that I held the keys to the kingdom, she pushed her way through the crowd. She didn't run to my mother to comfort her. She didn't run to my father to offer help. She ran to the edge of the stage, looking up at me with wide, frantic eyes. "Sky," she cried out, her voice pitching up into a register of desperate affection. "Oh, thank God. Thank God you finally stood up to them." The audacity was so breathtaking I almost laughed. Eleanor gripped the edge of the stage, her knuckles white. "I knew it," she shouted, making sure everyone around her could hear. "I told everyone, I said. Sky is the only honest one in that family. Didn't I say that?" She turned to the people behind her, looking for validation, but they were too busy trying to save their own skins to back up her lie. She turned back to me, reaching out a hand as if she expected me to pull her up onto the stage, up into the sanctuary of the winner's circle. "They are monsters. Sky," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at my parents. "The way they treated you, I always hated it. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared of Uncle Richard. You know how he is. But I am on your side. I have always been on your side. Cousin." I looked down at her hand. It was the same hand that had covered her mouth to hide her laughter when I walked into the room. "Eleanor," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone, cool and detached. "Yes, Sky, I'm here. I'm right here." "Do you remember my 16th birthday?" I asked. Her smile faltered. "What? My 16th birthday? You told the whole school I had been held back a year because I was mentally unstable. You planted drugs in my locker to try and get me expelled so you could take my spot as valedictorian." Eleanor's face went pale. "Sky, we were kids. And tonight," I continued, ignoring her stammering, "you told me I was going to be a star. You were right, but you are not part of the cast. Eleanor, you are just a fan, and I don't sign autographs for traitors." I turned away from her. I heard her gasp, then the sound of her trying to backpedal, but she was swallowed up by the surging crowd, because a bigger shark was moving in. Mr. Sterling, the billionaire industrialist, pushed past the security guards who were no longer sure who they were supposed to be protecting. His face was a mask of fury. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my father. "Richard!" Sterling bellowed. It was a voice that had crushed unions and hostile takeovers. "You son of a bitch!" My father looked up, his eyes hazy. Julian, please, it's a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Sterling slammed his hand onto the stage floor, inches from my father's foot. You tried to pawn off your bankruptcy on my son. You tried to merge your debt with my equity. That is not a misunderstanding. That is fraud. Sterling turned to the room, addressing the other investors. The deal is dead, he shouted. Merriweather Holdings is toxic. If anyone here has pending contracts with them, tear them up. I am pulling every dime of funding. Effective immediately. He turned back to my father, pointing a shaking finger. And you better get a good criminal defense attorney, Richard, because my legal team is going to be filing a suit for attempted corporate espionage and fraud by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I will take the shirt off your back. I will take the fillings out of your teeth. The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. This wasn't just a social snub. This was financial execution. My father shrank back into his chair, looking like a man watching a firing squad load their rifles. But the knife that cut the deepest was yet to come. My mother, Victoria, who had been scrambling on the floor collecting her scattered pearls, suddenly stopped. She looked at the angry crowd. She looked at Mr. Sterling threatening lawsuits. She looked at me, standing tall and untouchable, and then she looked at her husband. I watched the calculation happen in real time. I watched the survival instinct override 40 years of marriage. She realized that Richard was the anchor dragging her down, and if she wanted to survive, she had to cut the rope. She let the pearls drop from her hands. She actually crawled across the stage toward me. "Sky," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup, turning her into a grotesque caricature of the elegant woman she pretended to be. "Sky, baby, please listen to me." She grabbed the hem of my dress. I flinched, pulling my leg back as if a snake had touched me. "Don't touch me," I warned. "It wasn't me," she wailed, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek. "It was him. It was your father. He made me do it. Sky, I didn't want to. I told him we shouldn't treat you like that." The room went silent again, stunned by the sheer velocity of the betrayal. My father's head snapped up. He looked at his wife with an expression of absolute shock. "Victoria," he whispered. She ignored him. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "He forced me. Sky, he said if I didn't go along with the plan, he would cut me off too. I was a victim. Just like you, I love you. Sky, I'm your mother. Please, you can't let them take everything. You can't let him ruin me. I'm on your side now. It's us against him. Right? Just like it should be." I looked down at her. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. And I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a hollow, echoing void where a daughter's love used to be. "You love me," I repeated quietly. Yes, I love you more than anything." I was 10 years old. I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the silence of the ballroom, it carried to every corner. "Sky, don't," she whimpered. "I was 10 years old," I continued, "and I had a fever of 104. I was hallucinating. The doctors were worried it was meningitis. You were supposed to leave for Paris that night for Fashion Week. The nanny called you. She begged you to stay. She said I was calling for you." My mother froze. She remembered. "And do you remember what you said?" "Mother." "You were standing in the hallway, putting on your coat. I could see you through the crack in the door. You checked your watch and said, 'If she gets worse, call the hospital. I can't miss the opening show.' And you left." I leaned down, bringing my face close to hers. "You didn't come back for 3 weeks. You sent a postcard. It didn't even say, 'Get well soon.' It just described the wine." I stood up straight, pulling my dress from her grip. "You don't love me, Victoria. You don't love anyone. You only love the reflection of yourself you see in expensive things. And now that the mirror is broken, you are trying to find a new one. But I am not a mirror. I am a hammer." "You ungrateful witch!" The scream came from behind me. It was my father. The betrayal of his wife had finally snapped the last thread of his sanity. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic rage. He launched himself out of the chair, head down, charging at me like a bull. "I'll kill you," he screamed. "I'll kill you. You ruined everything." The crowd gasped. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, watching him come. But he never reached me. A massive shape stepped out of the shadows. It was Miller, the head of security, the man my father had paid for 10 years, the man who had been ordered to throw me out if I made a scene. Miller didn't just step in the way. He moved with the precision of a professional. He caught my father by the shoulders, using the old man's own momentum against him. He spun him around and slammed him face first onto the podium. Thud. "Stay down," Miller barked. My father struggled, flailing his arms, spitting curses. "Get your hands off me. I pay your salary. I am Richard Merriweather. I'll have you fired. I'll have you killed." Miller twisted my father's arm behind his back, pinning him helplessly against the wood. He looked up, past my struggling father, and locked eyes with me. "Ms. Merriweather," Miller said, his voice respectful, awaiting orders. "What would you like us to do with the intruder?" The intruder. My father stopped struggling. The word hit him harder than the physical impact. In his own party, in his own hotel, at his own podium, he was now the intruder. "Hold him there." "Miller," I said calmly, "the police are on their way." "You called the police," my mother shrieked from the floor. "I didn't have to," I said. "Look," I pointed to the back of the room. But before anyone could turn, another figure stood up from table 5. It was a young man in a cheap suit, clutching a tablet. It was Greg, my father's personal assistant, the man who carried his coffee and hid his affairs. "I have the files," Greg shouted, waving the tablet in the air. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the camera crews and the investors. "I have the real ledgers. I have the proof of the tax evasion." My father twisted his head, trying to see. "Greg, you little rat." Greg ignored him. He was trembling, but he was shouting to be heard over the rising chaos. "I was just following orders. He made me cook the books. I have the emails proving he threatened to fire me if I didn't hide the assets in the Cayman accounts. I want immunity. I'm turning state's witness." That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The room descended into absolute pandemonium. It was a scene from a nightmare. The veneer of civilization didn't just crack, it shattered. People were shouting, shoving each other to get away from the stage, or to get closer to hear the gossip. I heard the sound of glass breaking as a table was overturned. I saw flashes of light exploding continuously as the press photographers, sensing the scoop of the century, rushed the stage, snapping pictures of my mother crawling on the floor and my father pinned by security. Flash, flash, flash. The strobe lights gave the scene a jerky, terrifying quality. My mother covering her face, my father's contorted expression of hate, Eleanor trying to hide in the crowd, Greg waving his tablet like a white flag. And in the center of it all, I stood alone. I held the microphone at my side. I didn't need to speak anymore. The truth was doing all the talking. I looked out at the chaos. I saw the fear in the eyes of the people who had judged me. I saw the greed in the eyes of the people who had used me. I saw the total, utter destruction of the House of Merriweather. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was heavier than that. It was the weight of justice. I realized then that physical pain, a slap, a punch would have been a mercy for my parents. Physical pain fades, bruises heal, but this was permanent. I had taken the only two things they ever truly loved. I had taken their money, and I had taken their reputation. Without money, they were powerless. Without reputation, they were invisible. I had not just defeated them, I had erased them. I looked down at my father, who was now weeping, defeated, his face pressed against the wood of the podium. I looked at my mother, who was curled into a ball on the carpet, sobbing into her hands. "I told you," I whispered, though no one could hear me over the noise of the mob. "I told you I was the only wolf in the room." The doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. Blue and red lights from the street outside reflected off the crystal chandeliers. Uniformed officers poured in. The finale was beginning, but I wasn't watching the police. I was looking at the exit sign, glowing red in the distance. I was ready to leave. But there was one last loose end, one last secret that had to be spilled before the handcuffs clicked shut, and it wasn't going to come from me. It was going to come from the woman on the floor. The chaos was subsiding into a strange, tense, orderly conduct as the uniformed officers began to secure the perimeter. My father was handcuffed, his face pressed against the podium he had used to preach his false gospel of family values just an hour ago. The flashbulbs were still popping, but the manic energy of the crowd had dulled into a morbid fascination. They were witnessing a funeral, the burial of a dynasty, and they could not look away. I prepared to step down from the stage. The script I had written for this night was finished. I had exposed the fraud, seized the assets, and dismantled the lie. There was nothing left to say, or so I thought. My mother, Victoria, was still on the floor. She had stopped sobbing. She was sitting amidst the ruin of her reputation, her silver dress stained, her hair in disarray. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw something that chilled me more than her greed ever had. I saw pure, unadulterated malice. It was the look of a creature that knows it is dying and wants to take one last thing down with it. She scrambled to her feet. An officer moved to intercept her, but she waved him off with a manic screech. "You think you have won," she screamed, her voice tearing through the remnants of the silence. "You think you are so smart. You think you are the heir to the Merriweather throne." I stopped. I turned back to look at her. "It is over. Victoria, save your breath for the judge." "It is not over until I say it is," she shrieked. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face contorted into a mask of hatred so intense it looked painful. "You want the truth? You want to air all the dirty laundry? Fine. Let's air it all." She took a step forward. Ignoring the officer who grabbed her arm, she wrenched herself free, her eyes locked on mine. "You want to know why I never loved you?" she yelled. "You want to know why I left you alone when you were sick? You want to know why I looked at you every day of your miserable life with disgust?" The room went deathly silent. The police stopped moving. The investors stopped whispering. Even my father, pinned against the podium, lifted his head, his eyes widening in panic. "Victoria, don't," he groaned. "Don't do it." "Shut up, Richard," she snapped at him. She turned back to me, smiling a gruesome, victorious smile. "I never loved you because you are not mine." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. "You are not my daughter," she screamed, the words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I didn't give birth to you. You are nothing but a mistake. A bastard that Richard brought home 28 years ago. That is why I hate you. Every time I look at your face, I see her. I see the whore he cheated on me with." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. 200 people held their breath. This was the nuclear option. In a world obsessed with lineage and bloodlines, this was the ultimate severance. She had just told the world that I was an imposter. She had tried to strip me of my very identity. She stood there, panting, her chest heaving, waiting for me to collapse. She expected me to break. She expected the little girl who just wanted her mommy to finally shatter into a million pieces. I stood frozen. I looked at my father. He had dropped his head again, refusing to meet my gaze. It was the final confirmation of his cowardice. He had let a woman he despised raise his child, and he had let that child be abused for decades to protect his own secret. I looked back at Victoria. She was grinning now, thinking she had delivered the killing blow, and then I did the one thing she did not expect. I laughed. It started as a low chuckle, then bubbled up into a genuine, full-throated laugh. It wasn't the laugh of madness, it was the laugh of relief. It was the sound of a heavy door finally clicking shut. "You think that hurts me?" I asked, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. "You think telling me I did not come from your womb is an insult?" I shook my head. looking at her with a mixture of pity and amusement. Victoria, that is the best news I have heard all night. I reached into my small clutch bag one last time. I had come prepared for war, and I had brought ammunition for every front. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was folded in thirds, worn at the edges from being read and reread 1,000 times. You thought this was a secret? I asked, unfolding the paper. You thought you were protecting me from the truth. I held the paper up. I have known for 8 years. The grin vanished from Victoria's face. I took a DNA test when I was 20, I told the room, my voice steady and clear. I was in college. We were studying genetics. I looked at myself in the mirror, and then I looked at a picture of you, Victoria, and I realized that I didn't see a single trace of you in me. Not the eyes, not the chin, and certainly not the heart. I walked closer to the edge of the stage. So I swiped a hair from your brush the next time I came home, and I sent it to a lab. Do you want to know what the results said? I didn't wait for an answer. 0% match, no biological relation. I turned to my father. And then I did some digging. It wasn't hard. People talk. I found out about the woman you were seeing in '97, a waitress, an artist, a woman with a soul, unlike the one you married. My father flinched. She died in childbirth, didn't she? I asked softly. And you, being the spineless man you are, you brought me home to Victoria, and you made a deal. You told her she could have the money, the lifestyle, the social status, as long as she pretended to be the perfect mother to the perfect family. I turned back to Victoria. You didn't raise me because you wanted a child. You raised me because I was part of the contract. I was the price of admission for your life of luxury. Victoria was trembling. Her ultimate weapon had misfired. Instead of hurting me, she had just validated everything I had ever felt. The coldness, the cruelty, the distance. It wasn't because I was a bad daughter. It was because I was a constant reminder of her husband's betrayal. But here's the part you don't know, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that drew everyone in. Grandfather knew. My father's head snapped up. What? Grandfather knew everything, I said. He hired a private investigator 20 years ago. He knew I wasn't Victoria's. He knew I was the daughter of the woman he actually liked, the woman you abandoned. I looked at the trust document that was still lying on the podium. Why do you think he left everything to me, Dad? Do you think he would leave his legacy to a stranger? No. He left it to me because I am the only Merriweather left who isn't poisoned by her greed, I pointed at Victoria. And do you know what you just did? Mother or stepmother, I should say. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. You just confessed, in front of witnesses and police, that you are not my biological parent. You just admitted that our relationship is purely legal, not blood. I smiled. A cold, predatory smile. Which means you have absolutely no standing to challenge the trust. You cannot claim a right of heavy or maternal suffering. You are, legally speaking, a stranger who lived in my house. I turned to the police officer standing near the stage. Officer, I said, this woman just admitted that she is not my mother. She has no legal guardianship over me. And since I am an adult, she has no family privileges. I turned back to Victoria. I was going to let you keep the house in Connecticut. I lied. I was going to let you have a small stipend, for old time's sake, because I thought, somewhere deep down, maybe you did care. I ripped the paper in my hand in half. But you just freed me. You just cut the last string. You confirmed that I owe you nothing, not respect, not money, and certainly not mercy. Victoria realized her mistake. She collapsed again. Not in a performance this time, but in genuine, crushing defeat. She realized that by trying to hurt me, she had stripped herself of the only protection she had left, the title of mother. Sky, please, she whispered, her voice broken. I raised you. I fed you. You fed a prisoner, I corrected her. And now the prisoner owns the jail. I looked at the crowd. They were silent. Stunned by the brutality of the revelation, they looked at me not just with awe, but with a new kind of respect. I wasn't just a victim who fought back. I was a survivor of a 20-year lie. "Thank you," I said to Victoria. "Thank you for saying it. I have waited my whole life to hear you admit that I am not like you." I turned my back on her. It was the most liberating movement of my life. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at the sobbing woman on the floor. "Get them out of here," I said to the police. "They are trespassing on my property." The officers moved in. They hoisted my father up, dragging him away from the podium. They grabbed Victoria by the arms. She didn't fight. She was a shell, as they dragged her away, passing the spot where I stood. She looked up at me one last time. Her eyes were empty. "Who are you?" she whispered. I looked down at her, the spotlight catching the tears on my own face, tears not of sadness, but of cleansing. "I am Sky Merriweather," I said, "and I am the one who survived you." The doors opened, and the cool night air rushed in, mixing with the stale scent of white roses. I watched them go. I watched the two people who had defined my existence for 28 years disappear into the back of a police cruiser. I stood alone on the stage. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was the silence of a blank page. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I looked at the crowd. They were waiting, but I was done performing. "The show is over," I said into the microphone, my voice soft but final. "Go home." I dropped the microphone. Thud. It hit the floor with a dull sound of finality. I walked down the stairs. Not as a daughter, not as a victim, and not even as a winner. I walked down as an orphan who had just found herself. The path to the exit was clear. No one dared to stop me. No one dared to speak. I walked through the parted sea of tuxedos and gowns, heading toward the revolving doors, toward the street, toward the hamburger joint at 2 a.m. I was free. Truly, completely, devastatingly free. The doors to the ballroom did not just open, they were thrown wide with a force that rattled the hinges. The heavy mahogany slamming against the walls with a violence that silenced the last whispers of the scandalized crowd. The arrival of the authorities is usually a chaotic affair, a mess of shouting and confusion, but this was different. This was precise. This was surgical. A phalanx of men and women in dark windbreakers moved into the room. They did not look like the local beat cops who usually handled noise complaints. On the backs of their jackets, in stark, yellow letters, were 3 letters that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room: FBI. They were flanked by officers from the Economic Crimes Unit of the New York Police Department. They moved in a wedge formation, ignoring the stunned guests, ignoring the waiters holding trays of melting ice, ignoring the flashbulbs that were still popping sporadically like dying fireworks. They had a single target. My father, Richard, was still being held against the podium by his own head of security. When he saw the federal agents, the last vestige of his bravado evaporated. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had shut. "Richard Merriweather," the lead agent announced. He was a tall man with a face carved from granite, holding up a badge that caught the glare of the spotlight. "Victoria Merriweather." My mother, still on the floor, looked up. Her makeup was smeared, her dress torn, her pearls gone. She looked at the agents with a dazed expression, as if she couldn't quite comprehend how a birthday party had turned into a federal raid. "You are under arrest," the agent continued, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room without the need for a microphone. "Charges include securities fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny, wire fraud, and falsifying business records." "This is a mistake," my father sputtered, trying to straighten his jacket even as Miller. The security guard stepped back to let the agents take over. "Do you know who I am? I am a personal friend of the mayor. I play golf with the district attorney." The district attorney signed the warrant. "Mr. Merriweather," the agent said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The click of the handcuffs was a sound I will never forget. It was sharp, metallic, and final. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. My mother screamed when the female officer pulled her arms back. "My wrists. You are hurting me. Take them off. I am Victoria Merriweather. I am a victim here." "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited, tightening the cuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "I didn't do it," she wailed, looking frantically around the room for an ally. "It was Sky. She set us up. She hacked the accounts. Arrest her." The agent looked at me. I was standing 5 feet away, calm, composed, holding my ground. He gave me a curt nod. It was a nod of recognition. "Ms. Merriweather," he said to me, "we received the digital packet you forwarded to our secure server 20 minutes ago, the encrypted ledgers, the offshore account numbers, the email correspondence regarding the West Coast project." "Yes, Agent," I replied, my voice steady. "I also have the physical hard drive here." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, silver drive. I had carried it with me for 3 years, ever since the day I walked out of the company. It was my insurance policy. It was my smoking gun. "This contains the unedited metadata for the last 5 years of transactions," I said, handing it to him. "It proves that the charitable donations were funneled into personal accounts. It also contains the audio recordings of the board meetings where my father explicitly ordered the use of substandard concrete." My father went rigid. He stared at the drive in the agent's hand as if it were a poisonous snake. "You recorded us," he whispered. "You wiretapped your own family." "I documented a crime scene," I corrected him. "And tonight, I am handing over the evidence." The agent took the drive and slipped it into an evidence bag. "Thank you, ma'am. We will take it from here." "Get them out of my sight," I said. The agents grabbed my parents by the elbows. The walk from the stage to the exit was perhaps only 50 yards, but for Richard and Victoria Merriweather, it must have felt like 50 miles. They were marched down the stairs, the same stairs they had stood atop an hour ago, looking down on their kingdom. Now, they were being dragged through the mud. The crowd parted. This was the most brutal part of the evening. The guests, the senators, the CEOs, the socialites did not jeer. They did not shout. They simply recoiled. They pulled their expensive dresses and suits back as if my parents were contagious. They looked at the floor, or at the ceiling, anywhere to avoid making eye contact with the people they had toasted just moments before. I watched my father scan the faces of his friends. He looked at Mr. Henderson. Henderson turned his back. He looked at Mrs. Vanderwall. She pretended to be examining her fingernails. There is no loyalty among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among the social elite when the FBI is in the room. My mother was sobbing openly now, a ragged, ugly sound. "Eleanor, help me call the lawyer, call someone." But Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. She had buried herself deep in the back of the room, likely deleting my mother's number from her phone as we spoke. The heavy doors swallowed them up. I watched the flashing lights outside bathe the lobby in a chaotic rhythm of red and blue. And then, they were gone. The room was left in a stunned, vibrating silence. The king and queen were dead. Long live the queen. But the vacuum didn't last long. As soon as the police were gone, the dynamic in the room shifted again. The fear evaporated, replaced by a desperate, cloying need for self-preservation. The guests realized that while the old regime had fallen, a new power had risen. I was the owner of the trust. I was the owner of the building. I was the one holding the checkbook, and suddenly, everyone wanted to be my best friend. A woman in a red dress, I think she was on the board of the botanical garden, stepped forward, a nervous smile plastered on her face. "Sky, darling," she cooed, her voice shaking slightly. "That was incredibly brave of you. We had no idea. Simply no idea. We were all just terrified of Richard. You know, we wanted to speak up for you." "Yes," a man chimed in, stepping closer. "Sky, About that donation for the Opera House, I know your father promised it, but I assume, under your enlightened leadership, the Merriweather Foundation will continue its support. They started to close in on me, a circle of vultures, smelling fresh meat. They offered handshakes. They offered business cards. They offered compliments that tasted like ash in my mouth. You look stunning in blue, Sky. I always said you were the smart one. We should do lunch. Next week? My treat. I looked at them. I looked at the faces that had sneered at me when I walked in. I looked at the people who had stood silent while my mother called me a drug addict. I looked at the people who had been ready to watch me sign away my rights so they could keep drinking their free champagne. I felt a wave of nausea. Stop, I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. I raised my hand, signaling the security team. Miller, who was now looking at me with a newfound respect, or perhaps just fear of his new employer, stepped forward immediately. Ms. Merriweather, Miller asked. Clear the room, I said. The guest looked confused. But Sky, the woman in red stammered. The cake hasn't even been served. I walked over to the nearest table. It was laden with food, towers of lobster, trays of caviar, mountains of imported cheese, enough food to feed a village for a month. It was disgusting. It was a monument to gluttony built on stolen money. There is no party, I announced, my voice hard. This event is over. You are all trespassing. I turned to the hotel manager, who was hovering nervously by the kitchen entrance. Manager, I called out. Yes, Ms. Merriweather. He ran over, sweating. I want this room cleared in 10 minutes, I ordered. And the food? All of it. The lobster, the steaks, the desserts that haven't been touched. I want you to call the City Harvest and the Bowery Mission. Tell them to bring trucks. Tonight. Tonight, ma'am. Right now, I said. If a single shrimp goes into the garbage, I will fire you. This food was bought with stolen charity money. It is going back to the people who need it. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And the flowers, I added, looking at the thousands of white roses I hated so much. Send them to the hospitals, Mount Sinai, NYU. Send them to the oncology wards. Get them out of my sight. Sky. The voice came from the edge of the stage. It was Eleanor. My dear cousin Eleanor. She had emerged from her hiding spot, now that the police were gone. Sensing a last-ditch opportunity, she was trying to push past a security guard. Sky, you can't kick me out, she pleaded, putting on her best family face. I'm family. We're cousins. I can help you. You need someone to help you manage all this. You can't trust these outsiders. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at her. She looked pathetic. Family, I asked. Yes, we share blood well. She hesitated, remembering the DNA revelation. We share history. We grew up together. We did, I agreed. And I remember every moment of it. I remember who put the kick me sign on my back at the prom. I remember who told my first boyfriend I was cheating on him. I remember who laughed the loudest when Victoria called me a failure. I was just trying to fit in, Eleanor cried. I had to survive them too. Sky, I needed the allowance. My mom is sick. You know that. Your mother is in rehab in Malibu, I corrected her. And the Merriweather Trust has been paying $50,000 a month for her treatment, which mostly consists of spa days and tennis lessons. Eleanor's jaw dropped. Not anymore, I said. What? I am freezing the extended family disbursements, I told her, my voice devoid of pity. All of it? The allowances, the tuition payments for your brother, the country club memberships. It stops today. You can't do that, Eleanor screamed, her face twisting into ugliness. We will starve. Then get a job, I said. I hear Starbucks is hiring. They have great benefits. I signaled to Miller. Escort her out. And Eleanor. She looked back, tears of rage streaming down her face. Don't ever contact me again. If you show up at my office, if you show up at my apartment, I will have you arrested for harassment. We are done. Miller grabbed her arm. Eleanor screamed, cursing me, calling me every name in the book as she was dragged away. I didn't flinch. Her words were just noise, wind blowing through an empty house. I turned back to the remaining guests. They were moving now, scrambling toward the exits, realizing that the new regime was not open to negotiation. "Go," I shouted into the microphone one last time. "The show is over. Go home and look at yourselves in the mirror. Get out." The stampede was almost comical. The elite of New York, tripping over their gowns, rushing to get their coats, desperate to escape the judgment of the woman standing on the stage. Within 5 minutes, the room was empty. The silence that returned was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of the beginning of the night. It wasn't the shocked silence of the revelation. It was a hollow, echoing silence. The silence of a battlefield after the cannons have stopped firing. The staff moved quietly around the periphery, packing up food, carrying out flowers. They didn't look at me. They gave me a wide berth. I stood alone in the center of the stage. The spotlight was still on, burning hot on my skin. I looked down at the floor. I saw a single pearl that my mother had missed. It gleamed dully in the light. I reached down and picked it up. It was cold. It felt like a stone. I rolled it between my fingers. This tiny sphere represented everything they had destroyed themselves for: image, wealth, illusion. I walked to the edge of the stage and tossed it into a trash can. I felt light. I expected to feel triumphant. I expected to feel a surge of joy, a desire to pump my fist in the air, but I didn't. I felt a profound, aching emptiness, but it was a clean emptiness. It was the emptiness of a room that has been scrubbed of black mold. It was ready to be filled with something new. I looked at the microphone in my hand, the tool I had used to dismantle my life. "Goodbye, Victoria," I whispered to the empty room. "Goodbye, Richard." I placed the microphone on the podium. I walked down the stairs. My legs felt shaky, the adrenaline finally leaving my system. I was exhausted. I was hungry. I was 28 years old. And for the first time in my life, I was an orphan, and I was fine with that. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I didn't look back at the stage. I didn't look back at the banner that said, "Happy Birthday, Sky." I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the night. The heavy brass doors of the Sterling Heights swung shut behind me with a decisive thud. It was a sound I had been waiting to hear all night. It was the sound of a vault locking, but this time, I was on the outside. I stepped onto the sidewalk. The New York City air at 2 a.m. was sharp and biting. It carried the scent of exhaust fumes, wet pavement, and the distant, salty tang of the river. To anyone else, it might have smelled like pollution. To me, it smelled like oxygen. I took a deep lungful of it, letting the cold chill the back of my throat, washing away the cloying, suffocating perfume of thousands of white roses. The valet, a young man who looked tired and bored, straightened up when he saw me. He recognized me, of course. I was the woman who had just walked out of the scandal of the decade. He looked at the ticket in my hand, or rather, the lack of one. "Ms. Merriweather," he stammered, reaching for a set of keys on his podium. "Shall I bring your car around? The limousine is on standby." I looked at the long, sleek black car parked at the curb. It belonged to the company. It belonged to the image. It was a hearse for the living, designed to ferry my parents from one hollow social engagement to another, insulated from the real world by tinted glass and soundproofing. "No," I said. The word felt delicious on my tongue. "Keep it. Keep it, ma'am." "I don't need a ride," I told him. "And I don't need a limousine." I walked past him, my heels clicking on the concrete. I walked until I was half a block away. Standing under the flickering yellow light of a street lamp, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. My hands, which had been so steady on the microphone, were now trembling slightly, but it was a good tremble. It was the vibration of a machine that had been running at maximum capacity and was finally powering down. My clutch bag buzzed. Then it buzzed again, and again. It was a continuous, angry vibration against my hip. I opened the bag and pulled out my phone. The screen was lit up with notifications. They were cascading down the glass like a waterfall. Eleanor Skye. Please pick up. I didn't mean it. Julian Sterling. Let's talk. My father is overreacting. We can fix this. Unknown number. Hi, Skye. It's Aunt Margaret. So proud of you. Call me Mr. Henderson. Dear Skye. About that investment portfolio, I scrolled through them, watching the names flash by. These were the people who had watched me bleed for 3 hours. These were the people who had laughed. These were the people who had turned their backs. Now, suddenly, they all had my number. They all had apologies. They all had explanations. They thought I was still playing their game. They thought that because I had won, I would want to collect my trophies. They thought I would want to be the queen of their toxic little anthill. They were so wrong. I didn't swipe to unlock. I didn't reply. I reached into the side of the case and found the small pinhole release for the SIM card tray. I used the back of an earring to pop it open. The tiny chip, no bigger than a fingernail, popped out. It held my number. It held my contacts. It held the digital tether to every person who had ever made me feel small. I walked over to a wire mesh trash can bolted to the sidewalk. It was overflowing with old newspapers and coffee cups. I held the chip over the mouth of the bin. Connection terminated, I whispered. I dropped it. It vanished into the garbage without a sound. I put the phone back in my bag. It was just a piece of glass and metal now. A tool, not a leash. I looked up at the street. A yellow taxi was cruising slowly down Fifth Avenue, its on-duty light glowing like a beacon. It wasn't a sleek Uber Black. It wasn't a private car. It was a battered Ford Crown Victoria, a relic of a grittier New York, with a dent in the rear fender and a headlight that was slightly dim. I raised my hand. The cab screeched to a halt in front of me. The window rolled down, and a driver with a thick gray beard and a Yankees cap looked out. He eyed my expensive navy dress and the diamond studs in my ears, then looked at the empty street behind me. "You lost, lady?" he asked. His voice was rough, like gravel in a blender. I opened the back door and slid onto the cracked vinyl seat. It smelled of stale pine air freshener and old leather. It was the most comforting smell I had encountered all night. "No," I said, closing the door and shutting out the world of the Sterling Heights forever. "I'm not lost. I was lost for 28 years. I just got found." The driver watched me in the rearview mirror, confused. "Okay, where to?" I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for a moment. Where to? I could go anywhere. I had the deed to the penthouse. I had the keys to the mansion in the Hamptons. I had enough money to buy a ticket to Paris, or Tokyo, or the moon, but I didn't want any of that, not tonight. "Take me to a diner," I said. "Anywhere that sells the best burger in the city at 2 a.m, and fries, lots of fries." The driver grinned, his eyes crinkling in the mirror. "I know just the spot. Diner in Hell's Kitchen. Greasy, loud, but the beef is fresh." "Perfect," I said. "Drive." As the taxi pulled away, merging into the sparse late-night traffic, I watched the city scroll by through the window. The buildings were tall and imposing, monuments to commerce and ambition. My grandfather had helped build this skyline. My parents had tried to own it. I thought about the mansion in Connecticut, the sprawling estate where I had grown up, the cold marble floors, the empty dining room table, the library where I had hidden from the world. Legally, it was mine now. The trust transfer was absolute. I owned the house where I had been tormented. I owned the room where my mother had told me she hated me. I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. I wasn't going to live there. I wasn't going to sell it to another billionaire who would use it to hide his own family secrets. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small notebook I always carried. I clicked a pen and opened to a fresh page. The movement of the taxi made my handwriting shaky, but the idea was clear. The Merriweather Sanctuary. I would gut the place. I would tear out the cold marble and put in warm wood. I would tear down the iron gates. I would turn the ballroom into a counseling center. I would turn the servants' quarters into safe housing. I would use the money, the millions of dollars my parents had tried to steal, to fund a foundation for young adults who had been financially and emotionally abused by their families. I would create a place for the black sheep, a place for the scapegoats, a place for the kids who were told they were nothing because they didn't fit the mold. I would take the legacy of pain my parents had built and refine it into a legacy of healing. It was the ultimate revenge. Every dollar they had hoarded to maintain their image would now be spent destroying that image and helping the people they despised. The taxi slowed down and pulled up to a curb in Hell's Kitchen. A neon sign buzzed overhead. Joe's All-Night Diner. "We're here," the driver said. "Meter says $15.50. I handed him a $100 bill. "Keep the change." "Lady, are you serious?" "I've never been more serious," I said. "Buy yourself a good breakfast when you get off shift." I stepped out of the cab. The diner was bright, loud, and smelled of frying bacon. I walked in and sat at a booth in the back, the red vinyl squeaking beneath me. A waitress with a coffee pot appeared instantly. "Coffee, hun, please," I said, "and a cheeseburger, medium rare." "You got it." While I waited, I saw a small convenience store across the street. A sudden impulse seized me. I stood up. "I'll be right back," I told the waitress. I ran across the street, my dress fluttering in the wind. I walked into the bodega. The clerk barely looked up from his magazine. I walked to the aisle with the snack cakes. I picked up a package of chocolate cupcakes with the white swirl on top. Then I grabbed a cheap plastic lighter from the counter display. I paid for them and ran back to the diner. When my burger arrived, I pushed the plate aside for a moment. I unwrapped one of the cupcakes and set it on the Formica table. It looked ridiculous sitting there. A $2 cake in front of a woman wearing a dress that cost more than the waiter's car. I took the lighter and flicked it. The flame was small, dancing in the draft from the air conditioner. I held the flame to the top of the cupcake. There was no wick, so I just let the flame hover there, illuminating the white frosting, casting a warm golden glow on my face. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the diner. I saw Skye, not the daughter of Richard and Victoria, not the imposter, not the mistake. I saw a woman who had walked into the fire and come out made of steel. I saw the eyes of my grandfather. I saw the chin of the mother I never knew, the artist, the waitress, the woman with a soul. I had spent 28 years trying to figure out who I was. I thought I was defined by who loved me, or who didn't love me. I thought I was defined by my last name, but I wasn't. I was defined by what I did when the lights went out. I was defined by the moment I grabbed the microphone. I looked at the tiny flame. It was my birthday candle. No choir, no 200 guests, no pearls, just me, a diner booth, and the truth. "Make a wish," I whispered to myself. I closed my eyes. I didn't wish for happiness, because happiness is fleeting. I didn't wish for love, because I knew I had to find that within myself first. "I wish for this," I said softly. "I wish for the strength to never forget how it felt to stand up. I wish for myself, because I didn't give up." I blew out the flame. Whoosh! A thin trail of smoke rose from the cupcake. I smiled. It was the best birthday party I had ever had. I took a bite of the cupcake. It tasted like chemicals and sugar. It tasted like freedom. As I sat there, watching the sun begin to creep up over the skyline of New York City, turning the gray sky into a bruised purple, I realized something profound. Family is not a biological equation. It is not determined by whose DNA you carry or whose name is on your birth certificate. Family is not the people who hurt you and call it discipline. Family is not the people who steal from you and call it sacrifice. Family are the people who see you. Family are the people who respect your existence. Sometimes, you find family in a grandfather who leaves you a secret letter. Sometimes, you find it in a stranger who drives a taxi. And sometimes, the most important family member you need to find is yourself. You have to be willing to lose everything: the inheritance, the status, The approval to gain the one thing that actually matters, your own soul. I had lost my parents. I had lost my history. I had lost my place in society. But as I took a bite of that greasy, perfect burger, I knew the trade was worth it. I was Sky Merriweather, and for the first time in 28 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It has been a long journey from that stage at the Sterling Heights to this diner booth, and I am grateful you stayed with me until the very last bite of the cake. And if you are listening to this story right now, I want you to remember one thing. The microphone of your life is always there, waiting on the podium. It might be scary, your hands might shake, the people who claim to own you might try to snatch it away, but do not wait for them to hand it to you. They never will. You have to walk up those stairs, stare them in the eye, and grab it yourself. If you enjoyed watching the House of Merriweather crumble and want to see more stories about justice being served cold, please scroll down and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. I would love to know how far my voice has traveled. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Blue Payback. Smash that like button and hit the hype button so we can spread this message to everyone who needs to hear it. The next story is going to be even more explosive, and you won't want to miss it. Stay strong and keep fighting.